Hello, my name is Dr. David Rivera, and I'm a National Advisor with the Steve Fund. Welcome to our Young, Gifted, and Well webinar series. Today's topic is Responding to Bias on Campus, Institutional Support for Coping and Healing Among Students of Color. And I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Dr. Carlton Green, who is a psychologist and also an expert in addressing bias on college campuses. After watching this webinar, you will be able to describe the Inclusive Excellence Framework, identify how race-related events affect the mental health of students of color, describe personal and interpersonal approaches for responding to racism on college campuses, and articulate institutional and community interventions for addressing campus-wide bias. So Dr. Green, I thought it would be good for us to start out on Inclusive Excellence, which is a framework that many institutions have been using to address and direct their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Can you tell us a little bit more about this framework?
Sure. So back in 2000, I think it was, the American Association of Colleges and Universities gathered with some other scholars who were interested in diversity and equity issues on campuses, and they rolled out this Inclusive Excellence Framework. And their primary goal was to make sure that colleges and universities were situating diversity and equity and inclusion at the heart and mission of the institutions that were interested in really promoting more inclusive campuses. And so what they did was really look at the literature and talk to a number of experts about what are some of the more promising programs and more promising practices across campuses that could be then replicated in other areas on other campuses. And they came up with this framework. We just want to really highlight here a few of the aspects of the framework, really thinking about this model that you see from the University of Missouri, access and success, really paying attention to the fact that not only do we want our students to have access to higher education, students of color to have access to higher education, but we have to also pay attention to the fact that institutions of higher education were not necessarily created with students of color in mind to begin with, right? So when the first institution was founded, it was really for white, heterosexual, cisgender, male, Christian folks. And so the nature of higher education or the history of higher education culture has not been one that has really taken care of or promoted the excellence of students of color. So here we're talking about not only access, but making sure that students succeed. How do we implement programs and strategies and practices that really account for students coming in who are not the typical student that was really represented when higher ed was thought of, in addition to paying attention to the fact that students come from under-resourced backgrounds who might be students of color sometimes. And so we need to make sure that we're paying attention to the efforts of making sure that they get through. Another one of the aspects that they talk about is education and scholarship. How is it that we make intentional efforts that the curriculum is diverse? How do we actively invite students into conversation about diversity through the curriculum? It's not just enough to have programs on campus or have a classroom on campus where there is access to textbooks that talk about people of color, right? It's about what are the faculty doing to make sure that we're engaging students and making sure that we invite them into the conversation. And then probably one of the most important things, especially for our conversation today, is this sense of institutional climate and intergroup relations, which really pays attention to the psychological experiences that students of color have on college campuses, as well as the behavioral dimension of being on a college campus. How do people behave towards students of color, or how do they interact or don't interact with students of color? What we know is that dimension is one of the most significant for the success of students of color, as well as the well-being of students of color, because the perception that I'm not welcome here, or the perception that I am not an important facet of this community, or even the feeling that I don't matter in this place, can really take a toll on a person's well-being. And what we know is that has significant meaning for how well students will do, or whether or not they will excel, or whether or not they will be retained at the institution. The Inclusive Excellence Framework gives us 5 domains that we can really pay attention to situate diversity into the heart of the university. And it really says diversity is everybody's responsibility. It's not just one office's or a few staff members or a few faculty members. This is everybody's responsibility. So let's integrate it into everything that we're doing.
And I like how you ended on that piece about it being a community effort. For all too long, issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion often fell in the lap of one person
Yes.
or one office that was charged with that mandate for the entire institution. And we know that that's not really going to create the kind of cultural shift or change that is necessary for diversity, equity, and inclusion to actually be actualized, right, on a college campus.
Yeah.
So I was thinking also about, the reasons why we need to address these issues, right? Have to do directly with those forms of bias and discrimination that students are constantly kind of absorbing in their daily lives.
Right.
And we know that these aren't new.
Right.
That students of color, women, queer students, students with disabilities, any marginalized student has historically experienced the product of being marginalized via discrimination and bias, right, of a variety of flavors, if you will. Now the media has kind of shone a spotlight on these issues. So we're seeing day in, day out examples from across the country of critical incidents of bias. Do any come to mind right now?
Yeah, I think a lot about being a person who works on a college campus, right, working at the University of Maryland. And there was a point in the 2016 election where we were seeing chalking on our campus, where students were writing on the sidewalks, really derogatory messages about undocumented students or students who are here as a result of DACA, right? That piece really, for me, feels really painful, right, to even be thinking about it or even be talking about it, because it was a direct message to those students that they were not welcome on our campus. And it was also, people weren't taking into account how this would affect those students, right, and their literal presence on campus or their ability to just walk on campus on a day-to-day basis, right? So that one in particular really feels poignant for me. How about for you?
Yeah, no, similarly on our campus, I work at Queens College, and it's probably one of the most diverse campuses in the world. Queens, the borough of Queens, is probably one of the most diverse geographic areas in the world. So we have people of all faiths, of all colors, of all walks of life, kind of integrated into kind of a smaller space. And so issues are likely to happen, right? When worldviews collide, that kind of sets the stage for bias to occur. If people aren't taking kind of the steps to have the self-awareness about how their presence and their behaviors and their words impact other people. So we're not immune to that just because we have diversity. Some institutions do believe that they're immune to these issues when they happen to be extremely diverse, but that's not the case.
Right.
So over the winter break recently, there was a swastika drawn on the walls of one of the bathrooms. And this has happened on our campus before. And it's good to think about the various communities that are impacted by the swastika. I think automatic attention went to the Jewish students. But also, it was also mentioned that students of color, especially black students, see that as a sign of white supremacy, right? And so this one symbol has several different meanings impacting a variety of campus communities. And what I found hopeful, or at least inspiring from the institution, is that they quickly responded to this incident very publicly via an email blast about what the incident was, about the resources on campus that students can turn to seek additional support, and then just a misalignment with our mission. But we didn't completely reject this as being something that we're not about, because this is a reflection of what we're about. Right?
Yes, and it's a reflection of what higher education has been about, right, in some ways. Not just the education of students, but there has been what Joe Fagan calls sort of like a white racial frame, right, around higher education that really sees it as being a place for white students or for white people, right? And so to have an influx of more students of color onto college campuses, there has been some pushback around that. And what we see, and I would suggest for any university administrator to be thinking about this, is that we see this racial terrorism happening, right? These signs or these swastikas, the chalking on the sidewalks, the notes that get left on students' residence halls doors, right? It's a sign of racial terrorism. And I use that intentionally, going on the words of Brian Stevenson, right? I would encourage administrators to be reading his book, Just Mercy, because it does a really good job of helping people to understand exactly what the impact of this type of racial terrorism is for people of color. And sometimes I was just with a group doing some training a few weeks ago, and it became really apparent to me. So actually, somebody gave voice to this. I was training a group of student affairs administrators, and the chief student affairs administrator on campus said during the training, where I do some experiential things, that he had forgotten what it was like to be a student of color on a college campus and really experience the bias and the animus and the racial terrorism, right? And so the farther that administrators move away from the experience, it's easier for them to forget the real impact that can have on students' lives. And so for me, even as we have sort of like the headlines up, right? We really want people to be paying attention to the headlines for a specific reason. People have to remember what this feels like, right?
Exactly.
If you can remember what this feels like, if we can center the harm that is taking place for students of color on college campuses, that knowledge, that sense, that experience, that felt sense should be informing how you're approaching your policies and your practices in the formation of your community, right? We can't forget
Definitely. And what I'm hearing you saying is that we need to be centering the voices of those that are marginalized in many ways in terms of how we provide services,
Right.
but in terms of how we get that narrative of
Right.
what their lived experience is like. Because our lived experiences, even though we are people of color, we went to undergrad 20 plus years ago.
Right.
Not
Right.
to date
Exactly.
us, but it's been some time, and we've developed a set of resources along the way, and a set of protections and privileges, really, that create a different reality for us in terms
Right.
of these biases and how we absorb them and
Yes.
process them compared to a younger person who might be figuring this out relatively not for the first time, but more kind of new for them in a way.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
Which is a huge part, we'll keep talking about this today, which is a huge part to me from my time in the counseling center when I was working as a staff psychologist in the counseling center. One of the things that became really apparent to me was the lack of racial socialization for a lot of this current generation of students of color. And really what I'm referring to is like parents actively preparing their students or preparing their children for understanding how race operates in the world. Parents actively or not so actively preparing their students with a sense of racial pride and not giving them these tools that they need in order to be able to cope with racism. And so when students got to the college campus with this excitement about being there, with the promise of the best 4 years of your life, right? With the promise of this is the place that I'm going to get my part of the American dream, and they bump into the racism that's there in a very unexpected way.
They do.
It sets them back, right? And I don't know that was actually here's what I know. For students who are much more prepared, they are not set back as much. The students who are not prepared, they experience tremendous setbacks. So we really have to be thinking about how we're preparing students of color to enter higher education, regardless, historically white universities, wherever they're going, right? If they're going to some setting, how are we preparing them for dealing with racism?
Yeah, because the threats don't just come from the institution. Now, because of social media, they're coming from all directions at all times. So just seeing an article about an incident that occurred on another campus can induce that sense of vicarious discrimination or the consequences of it.
Right.
Yeah, so really equipping students, as you're mentioning, with how to navigate these isms is necessary for success. It's one of those non-cognitive variables that has been spoken and researched about that marginalized folks might have an experience with, but definitely need to have the skills for in order to succeed academically.
Yes,
Those are
very much
tied
so.
together
So closely
inextricably.
linked. Yeah.
So what are some of those impacts? So when I think about the impact which we're going towards, I think about a whole list of issues, and those of you viewing this talk, you can see those listed on the screen. One of those at the top is dignitary harm, which is a concept that I heard from Kimberly Crenshaw, the legal scholar and critical race theorist and intersectionality scholar, who really spoke about the harm that occurs when somebody isn't valued for all of the identities that make up their worldview and who they are. Like if you have a threat to one of them, it's going to be a threat to your entire personhood. And Professor Crenshaw was theorizing that threat to one's self-worth can then prevent somebody from actualizing their full potential.
Exactly.
And so the full potential that we want our students to actualize has to do with earning that degree, right? And developing their personhood holistically, socially, psychologically, spiritually. And if they're feeling that they're not worthy of that, if they feel that they're not worthy of good things to come to them, then there's going to be automatic roadblocks. And I think that's what leads to some of these other things on this list, such as academic disengagement, which is what we don't want to happen, meaning that there's so many threats in that climate, either in the classroom or from the peers or from the professor, that the student feels so threatened that they don't want to engage with that environment, so they don't go to class. I had kind of these experiences during my first year of undergrad. I almost didn't go back because of that threat. Thankfully, I was able to get connected to resources that helped me along the way. And that's what we're hoping to provide for students now. Development of a negative self-concept. So if you think about yourself and your academic abilities as being deficient in ways which kind of map onto the stereotypes that many people of color have to endure regarding assailments to their intellect, right? That might then impact your thoughts of how academically inclined am I?
Or how academically equipped am I to be able to succeed here, right?
Exactly.
I think that one of the things, the first time you introduced this notion of dignitary harm to me, it really resonated because one of the things that in my dissertation research and so the other scholarship that I was working on, what became apparent to me that I was able to give some voice to is that as people of color, our racial selves, our racial identity is so important to us, right? We spend a lot of time thinking about it. We spend a lot of time investing and sort of like developing it and trying to get it to be this mature sense of being in the world. We derive a lot of pride from it. There's a lot of cultural capital that comes from it. We have behavioral skills, that go along with it. And so when I was listening to you talk about that, I was thinking about like, oh, it's almost like somebody is attacking that very part of us that is life-giving, right? Or that is sustaining for us, right? And so in some ways, it's almost about somebody like cutting off your arm or cutting off your foot, right? And trying and expecting you to just keep going, right? Continue to run or continue to walk or continue to think or write or, whatever it happens to be, while this really significant part of you is under attack, right? And so the sense of dignitary harm really drew that out for me, even as you were sharing it with me the first time. And so I think I still keep coming back to it, thinking about it when I'm working with folks on different campuses.
Yeah, preserving one's dignity, I think that is key to helping people to optimize their true selves and develop more of a cohesive sense of being. One other one on this list I want to highlight is imposter phenomenon. We often hear students commenting, and I myself still have this operating for me. I see your head shaking. You probably have instances of imposter phenomenon. It might be enacting itself right now. But the sense of imposter phenomenon then makes people feel like they're a phony. Right? That they don't truly believe in themselves, or they don't believe that others believe in themselves enough for them to actually take up space in these academic communities or in these social spaces that are necessary for them to get support and to flourish as people. And so I think that addressing imposter phenomenon is crucial for students. Even just providing the framework of imposter phenomenon is an intervention in and of itself. That you can remind yourself whenever you hear that negative voice kind of rearing its ugly head, which all of us have, right? That you can counter it by saying, you're just imposter phenomenon. I truly have these gifts and they're meaningful. So developing some of this positive self-talk, addressing the narrative that we have for how we understand ourselves can be extremely important. There's some other race-related stress impacts. Maybe you can talk about some of those.
Yeah, so we know this as psychologists, which becomes really important for college campuses or college administrators to really factor into their conversation, especially when they're thinking about what it means to create an environment where people matter, right? If we're talking about inclusion, how do we create an environment where people matter? What we know from the race-related stress literature that you see on the screen there is that people's psychological selves, their being, can be really impacted. And so if you take a look at the different domains there, sort of like the cognitive domain, if a person is having trouble thinking, like because they are having these intrusive thoughts, or they're just having difficulty concentrating, or they're having difficulty focusing on what it is that they're supposed to be working on. Think about what that means for a college student, right? It's a really important aspect of just getting through an academic program or making progress in an academic degree program.
It's important to acknowledge that our cognitive resources are limited and need to be restored on a regular basis.
On a regular basis. Right. And if you take a look at sort of like the physiological, right, which is a direct connection, if you think about for folks who experience race-related stress, the anxiety level can be really high physiologically, and we know that that is about cortisol in your body, right? And if the cortisol never comes back down to sort of like homeostasis or to baseline, then you're activated.
Right.
And what does that mean? It probably means that you're not getting the type of rest and sleep that you need in order for your cognitive processes to sort of like be restored, right? The other piece there that I think is really important for students of color in particular, we know that students of color can talk more about the physiological symptoms or signs that they're experiencing. We have language for those things, right? We can talk about the headaches, or we can talk about the stomach aches, and paying attention to the fact that headaches, stomach aches, those things take you out of the classroom, right? They take you out of the library. They set you up such that you have to spend time either in your room or you're going to the health center, right? It really gets in the way of the regular academic functioning of a student. And maybe it becomes really important to just say this explicitly. When we're talking about race-related stress, we're talking about the experiences that students of color have as a result of the racism that they're experiencing because they're being targeted. So similar to what we know about sexual assault, how sexual assault can leave some real injuries on those who experience sexual assault. Racism does the same thing. Race-related stress takes a toll on people. And if we're not remembering that racism or race-related stress is a phenomenon that actually impacts people, we will forget that students' functioning is being really deleteriously impacted by that, right? So it becomes important, again, not only, in my opinion, for university administrators to be talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, we have to be talking about racism and anti-racism when it comes to students of color, which, is a slight shift from diversity, equity, inclusion work, right? But if, in fact, we want our students of color to succeed, we have to make sure that we're talking about racism and anti-racism.
And those impacts, right?
And those
that
impacts.
It's having, those real-life impacts that you just went over. So what can we do? So you and I did some discussions about an institutional intervention model that we developed that includes both things that are remediation, right, which is what we often see. There's often a response to the bias that's already occurred. Right. And that's because what you just explained, these institutions were created years ago for a certain population and not for those of us that are marginalized within that organization. And so those structures are still intact, which then create those norms that then perpetuate the bias, right? And so remediation, but we also believe in prevention. Right? If we don't change the structures, if we don't change the policies, right, those manifestations of bias are going to continue to occur. And so that's what the remediation and prevention need to occur in concert with each other as we work towards creating truly diverse, equitable, and inclusive institutions. We also conceptualized it on a variety of levels, the personal, the intrapersonal, the institutional, and the community. So one area I'd like to talk about is addressing microaggressions. We kind of brought that up earlier. So microaggressions are these subtle, covert forms of discrimination that occur on a daily basis for those from marginalized experiences. They can occur one-on-one through dialogue. They can be embedded in the environment. My mentor, Daryl Dwing-Sue, and his current research team published an article in the American Psychologist in January 2019 that delineated a four-step process model for addressing microaggressions, especially on the interpersonal level. And very quickly, the first part has to do with making the invisible visible, right? Which means undermining that meta-communication. So if I'm the recipient of a microaggression. Let's say someone asks me where I'm from, which is a very common question, one that isn't a microaggression by itself. I give them the answer, I'm from Wyoming. Know where you really from? I say I'm from Cheyenne. Know where you really from? I know where they're going, right? And so I would stop there and be like, are you really asking me about my nationality or my country of origin, where my people came from? Because if that's the case, it's Mexican, right? And then the assumption there is that I'm not from this country. And so in that way, I kind of would also say I was born and raised in Wyoming to kind of, again, undermine that metacommunication and reveal more of the truth. The next part is expressing some kind of disagreement. People often have a hard time articulating what to say in that microaggression encounter. One, because we're still kind of making sense of it, and two, because of the intense emotions that often overtake the person's experience. And so there are nonverbal ways of communicating disagreement. And nonverbal communication is probably about 85% of our communication and can be much more effective than the words that we're speaking. So just crossing your arms and maybe giving a little bit of a frown, maybe stepping away, that will send a big message that I don't agree with what's going on here. If I'm crossing my arms, maybe I'm protecting myself because of what I'm experiencing in this moment.
You're protecting your dignity.
Exactly. I'm trying to keep my dignity intact.
Yeah.
And then the third part of it has to do with educating the offender about the difference between intention and impact. The conversation often gets stuck on intention, where the aggressor might say, I didn't mean for that to happen, or I didn't mean to say that, or I was just joking. However, I was still harmed by feeling invalidated, right? That harm still remains regardless of the intention, right? And so having a more of an impact conversation as opposed to an intention conversation can also help to highlight the real experience of what happens when a microaggression is committed. And then the last part is to seek some kind of external support. So developing a social support network of people who understand your cultural background, who might have a similarity. Like I talk to you about experiences that I have because I know that you'll have that understanding. And so really teaching young people to develop those communities of support that can offer them affirmations, especially when they're dealing with so many invalidations and microaggressions in their life. What other ways can we work on these issues?
It's interesting. I want to follow up on the microaggressions conversation really quickly because I think about doing this work on my own campus, right, where certainly a part of the way that you lay this out is about how is it that the person who is being targeted should think about responding or taking care of themselves in those instances. I think that there is also, I think this is in the Sue et al. 2019 article, about the possibility that there are those who are bystanders or the observers in the room also need to take some responsibility for these microaggressions, right? And if we're thinking about a diversity, equity, inclusion plan on a college campus, one of the things that all of our campuses should be undertaking is how do we help white students, male students, heterosexual students take some responsibility for also stepping in when they observe that a minoritized person is being hurt by a microaggression, right? Because if we leave it up to the responsibility of those who are minoritized or those who are being targeted to always do that work, we're actually not doing anything really different than what we've already been doing, right? And so there has to be a real focus on how do we equip other folks who are observing, who are standing by with some skills for intervening as well.
Super important because they can use their privilege in a productive way. We often talk about privilege and the harmful impacts of it, but there are also benefits of having privilege and using it in an effective way to kind of help undo this harm that's being done, or at least address it and bring light to it.
Yeah, it's real consistent. One of the things that I find myself constantly saying on my campus is we are a community, and if somebody in the community gets hurt, then we're all hurting, right? And we, like the way that our body takes care of itself, right? You know, if we get a cut or something, the blood rushes to the place where we're cutting as a way of sort of like trying to take care of that. We have to figure out in our communities on college campuses, how do we rush to the place that's being hurt? Because it's going to be really important for us to take care of that hurt, lest it expands into something more, right? I think that, you know, also one of the things that I wanted to highlight here as well is that it goes back to the sense of preparing students for racism on campuses. So some colleagues and I at Boston College through the Institute for the Study and Promotion of Race and Culture with my mentor, Dr. Helms, wrote a piece a few years ago about how, actually the piece was entitled #Racial Trauma is Real. But the big piece of that is that we had a racism recovery plan for students, and well, for people of color, really. But you know, our context is here talking about college campuses, so actually that could be students, faculty, and staff on a college campus. People need to expect that racism is going to occur, And that means that if it's going to occur, you need to have a plan for recovering. Because what we know is, as we've seen, it can have a real impact on our bodies, right? A real impact on our psychological selves as well as our physical selves. And so you need a plan, right? And so in that plan, we really highlight what it's like to take note for yourself of what are you like when you are doing well, right? What activities are you engaged in? What are your thoughts like? What is your social time like? Who are you spending time with when things are really going well? Because when things are not going well, right, you need to remember that, because that's an indicator that, oh, I'm not engaging in these activities anymore. I'm not having these feelings, or I'm not reading these things, whatever it happens to be. And then from there, we really try to set people up with sort of like a daily maintenance or a daily centeredness plan, where you can list the things that you need to do in order to be able to self-correct, right? And what's really important about it is that you put some effort into this before the racism occurs. We've seen, like, when the racism occurs, your cognitive faculties are depleted, right? Your executive functioning is really impaired, and executive functioning is here in this place where we make good decisions, where we can prioritize things, where we can think clearly, right? And so racism actually makes us not think so clearly, right? And so if you have the centeredness plan, you can actually have some strategies for being able to come back, right? And then the other piece that's a really important part of the plan is to know what your triggers are. Right? For many of us, we probably know what the triggers are, right? We just have not really sat down and thought about them before. I know, like, being in a space where something racist is said, of course, that's the trigger. The indicator for me is that I might tilt my head and say, did that just happen? Right? That's all. It's always an indicator, like something did just happen in this space, right, that I need to attend to. And what we know is that students in those types of situations, when they get triggered, then they can start having the ruminations about them, right? And again, your cognitive function is really impacted that way. So to know what your triggers are, then you have the centeredness plan that you can come back to then begin deal with the different phases. So, like, if you're in an acute phase, or if you're in a severe phase, or if you're really sort of like in a disaster phase, right, around racism. Moving through to, what do you do to reintegrate yourself back into your community of support, right, which is going to be really necessary for recovering from and surviving racism. But the fundamental thing is, you need a plan, because it's going to occur, right? So even as we're talking about these things, how do you survive microaggressions? How do you survive racism? It's really about what are you putting in place? What skills and tools are you putting in place for yourself to be able to resist racism, right? Because it's going to happen.
Right, in a very proactive, overt way.
Right.
I love that, that the word plan is there, because that means that we're being proactive. We can actually plan for this because we know it's going to happen.
Right.
If you know that there's a likelihood that you might get into a car accident every time you drive, you're probably going to put a seatbelt on, right? So you're going to protect yourself. So we can arm students. I love the framework that you just shared, because that's a beautiful way and an elegant way for students to arm themselves for these things that they are going to encounter.
Right. And probably similar to the conversation about microaggressions, we should also say, white people, white administrators, white faculty, white staff, white students also need a plan for when racism occurs, right? We didn't write that plan. But we really need to be thinking about, how do we help white people deal with their white racial anxiety? How do we help them deal with their white fragility? How do we deal with their white rage, whatever it happens to be, wherever they are, as a result of sort of like living in a racist society? Because we also need white people to be doing the work, right, in order to be able to make sure that we're creating inclusive, equitable campuses for students of color. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a community effort. So the final intervention I'd like to introduce is the Equity and Mental Health Framework that the Steve Fund and the Jed Foundation teamed up to develop. Empirically based set of 10 recommendations and 10 implementation strategies that institutions can use to address these issues in a very overt and systematized way, right? And so I'm not going to go over them in detail, but if the viewers, if you can go to equityandmentalhealth.org, you can find out more information about these 10 recommendations that your institution can use as an institution, but that you can use in terms of your specific role. If you're faculty, if you're staff, if you're a student, there are various things that everyone can do that are mapped onto this framework. So, Dr. Green, thank you for joining me today. This was a very informative conversation. I think that the information that you shared is going to be very helpful for our viewers as they work towards kind of making their institutions more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Dave. It's always great to work with you.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. Again, I would invite you to go to stevefund.org where you can find this webinar and more webinars on topics related to promoting and addressing the mental health well-being of students of color, as well as equityandmentalhealth.org where you can find the equity and mental health framework that we developed with the Jed Foundation, and also just joining the Steve Fund family as we work towards promoting and addressing these issues that impact the well-being of students of color. Thank you.